Before we get into the real history of Thanksgiving, I want to say something upfront. I'm not here to ruin anyone's holiday. I'm not telling you not to gather with your family or not to feel grateful. But every time I tell the truth about American history, I piss somebody off. When I explained who Christopher Columbus really was, some people were extremely defensive. Well, the truth is uncomfortable sometimes. It challenges the stories we were raised on. It forces us to confront the gap between what we were taught and what actually happened. But here's what we all need to understand. The truth doesn't become less true just because it makes people uncomfortable. And I'll never choose ignorance just because it feels easier. A part of what's happening in this country right now is the push to retreat back into comforting myths, to pretend that the past was simpler, kinder than it really was. That's the America some people want, one built on denial and on erasing the parts of history that don't fit their narrative. But I don't live in a version of America where we hide from history, and I won't teach a version of history that asks me to look away. So if you're still with me, let's talk about the real story of Thanksgiving, where it actually came from, what happened before and after that famous meal, and why the truth matters now more than ever. Most people think the story begins in 1620 with the Pilgrims. It does not. European contact with indigenous nations along the northeast coast began over a century earlier. Spanish, French, and English ships were coming through the region throughout the 1500s. They came to fish, trade, and sometimes raid. They took furs and other resources. They kidnapped native men and boys, sold some into slavery, and forced others to work on their ships. They weren't building permanent settlements in New England yet, but they were absolutely making contact. Those encounters left behind something devastating. From 1616 to 1619, a European-born epidemic tore through the region, killing up to 90% of indigenous people along parts of the coast. 90%. Entire villages were emptied. So when the Pilgrims arrived in 1620, they did not find untouched wilderness. They found a homeland, the homeland of the Wampanoags, that had already been reshaped by decades of European contact and by a catastrophic disease Europeans brought with them. And on a personal note, I grew up on Wampanoag, or as we said it, Wampanoag land. King Philip, or Metacomet, his body is buried in my hometown. When I was 8 years old, during our town's tricentennial celebration, I played King Philip in a school pageant. I didn't know the full history yet, but I do remember standing there in that costume, listening to the story the adults told us and feeling something I didn't quite have words for. I remember feeling kind of angry on his behalf. Angry that his people's land was taken, angry that the colonists in the stories were framed as heroes when they were not treating indigenous people with any dignity and were stripping them of their rights. A few years ago, maybe 12, I found out that one side of my family traces back to the Mayflower, and at first I felt proud. That's how we're taught to feel, like it's a badge of honor, proof of our early American roots. But when you grow up on a Wampanoag land, and when you know what happened to the people who lived there long before the Pilgrims arrived, it hits differently. I remembered the epidemic, the loss, the stolen land, the violence that followed, and the pride I felt was significantly diminished. I won't say it disappeared completely, but if your family roots trace back to the Pilgrims, you inherit responsibility, not just nostalgia. You don't get to celebrate the mythology without reckoning with the truth. So that's my personal connection here. Let's go back to history. The famous 1621 meal, the so-called First Thanksgiving, it did happen, but it wasn't a warm holiday gathering, and it wasn't the symbol of unity the U.S. later turned it into. The Pilgrims had their first successful harvest, and to celebrate, they fired guns. The Wampanoags heard the shots and arrived prepared to defend their people. Diplomacy, caution, and necessity turned a moment of potential conflict into a shared meal. It was a fragile truce, nothing more. And within a generation, that truce collapsed. As more English settlers arrived, they demanded more land, imposed their laws on the natives, and undermined Wampanoag sovereignty. Pressure built, injustices piled up, and in 1675, everything exploded. King Philip's War broke out, one of the deadliest wars per capita in American history. Metacomet, the man whose grave I grew up near, led a resistance not because he hated the colonists, but because they had taken nearly everything away from his people. When the war ended, thousands of indigenous people were killed. Survivors were enslaved in the Caribbean or forced into servitude in New England towns. The Wampanoag political structure was basically destroyed. And once the natives were completely subdued, colonists marked their victory with a day of Thanksgiving, not for peace, but for conquest. So how did we end up with the cheerful Thanksgiving story? Simple answer, we invented it. In the 1800s, especially after the Civil War, writers and politicians rewrote Thanksgiving into a national myth, something wholesome, something unifying and comforting. And in that process, they erased the epidemic, the violence, the stolen land, the war, the enslavement, and the genocide. They replaced it with a feel-good harvest festival, a sanitized origin story that made America feel innocent. But the truth, you don't honor your country by burying its history. I wish I could shake people who believe that. You honor your history by facing the truth and choosing to do better. So this week, as you sit with your family and friends, I want you to hold two truths at once: gratitude for your people and honesty about the people who paid the price for the world you live in today. Honor the Wampanoag Nation. Honor all indigenous communities who endured epidemic, land theft, forced assimilation, stolen children, and centuries of broken treaties. Honor their survival because they are still here. They're still fighting, still leading, and still shaping this land. And if you want to support indigenous communities in ways that actually matter, learn whose land you're on. Start there. Use Native Land Digital. I'll put the website in the comments. Then read about those nations. It's important to know whose land it was before you. Support Native-led organizations like the Native American Rights Fund and local tribal mutual aid groups. Buy from indigenous people and businesses. Support real families and cultural preservation. Donate to language revitalization and youth programs. Language revival is resistance. Follow indigenous writers, journalists, and educators. Share their work. Let their voices lead. Thanksgiving doesn't need to be a myth. It can be a moment of truth, a moment to honor the people who were here first, acknowledge what was taken, and commit to doing better. Can we do that, please? And if this helped you learn something, if you value honest history, my tip jar is in my bio.